Hopefully I get this done before I lose the light. The eclipse is happening today, people. If you care. I think it already happened. That already happened. But it's happening right now. Hello everyone. Welcome back to part 2 of my Vivienne Westwood series. And if you haven't seen part 1, I will try to link it, but also I only have like 3 videos on my page, so it shouldn't be that hard to find it. What else? I don't know. I don't have anything else to say. Anyway, I hope you're having a wonderful day, or are just ready to feel inspired, because this video is all about calling for a revolution. And if you exist today, you know that the current state of the world is heading towards a revolution. It's inevitable. So maybe this video will inspire you to get involved in whatever way you can. And again, I just want to preface this video by saying that I will be showing photos that feature sexually explicit content, anti-Semitic imagery, among other things. This really just comes with the territory of talking about Vivienne Westwood. But again, I don't condone the imagery or ideologies we will speak about, but we will definitely be talking about them because we must. But enough of me rambling. Let's get into this because we have a lot to cover, because I promised you in the last video that we would talk about punk and we would talk about the Sex Pistols. And today we will. Punk was everything to me and Malcolm. I don't speak about it now as much as people seem to think I should, but it's not because I'm ashamed or think it's passé or anything. There are things that you can never escape from your past. I tried to run away from it all after Malcolm, but I am now proud of my role as a punk, because I think it contributed to the stance many young people take to this day. Don't trust the government, ever. Part 1 left off with the creation and introduction of the Sex Pistols. We did not give them a formal introduction, but in this video we will, right now to be exact. So after Malcolm returned from his 6-month trip to the US, following the New York Dolls and Richard Hell around, he came back to London inspired, ready to form his own band and create a punk movement more English. He took up managing the Strand, aka Cuddy Jones and his Sex Pistols, which consisted of Steve Jones, Glenn Matlock, and Paul Cook. And at Vivienne's insistence, she had Malcolm bring in John, who had been by the shop. Just John. However, she meant Simon John Ritchie, aka Sid Vicious, but Malcolm confusedly brought in John Linden, aka Johnny Rotten. Sid Vicious wouldn't formally join the band until 1977, and he was only in the band for a few months. But by bringing in John Linden, or Johnny Rotten, as we are going to call him, the Sex Pistols were able to become what they were. They were rough. They sounded horrible. They couldn't sing or play their instruments, but Malcolm loved them. He told Vivienne they were the worst band he'd ever heard, but it didn't matter. What truly mattered was that they were so good at being bad, and they had the right amount of abusive raw potential that he was looking for.
I used to sell rock and roll records, and I used to sell clothes. Mm-hmm. And I used to have to stop a hell of a lot of thievery. And in particular, there were 2 guys It drove me bloody mad.
By stealing stuff constantly?
I was just forever running down the bloody street. I was never in the store. And I, in the end, decided one day when they came into the store to immediately start talking to them and watch them.
Mm-hmm.
And they got talking to me, and they weren't starting to thieve this time. They just told me about the fact that they had a rock and roll band.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't believe them, really. But out of curiosity, I took a peek down their so-called den and studio. It was like an Aladdin's cave. Mm-hmm. This equipment must have cost a minimum of $200,000 or more.
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't play any of it. And I started to think, is this their equipment? Or is this equipment that's come from somewhere else? And then I suddenly realised it had come from David Bowie's stage. It had come from Brian Ferry's back van in his studio. It had come from raiding Keith Richards' house. But alongside the equipment, there were TVs and fur coats. And then I realised the fur coat belonged to Anita Pallenberg, Keith's girlfriend at the time. And then I discovered it was Keith's actual TV set as well. So I actually thought they must be very good at something. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I decided to help them. It was a kind of a moment of madness. Mm-hmm. You go for it, as they say.
Now, these two were?
Well, they were two thieves. Their names are probably renowned today.
Mm-hmm. Well, Johnny Rotten, one of them?
No. He was a good boy.
Oh.
Steve Jones.
Steve Jones, okay.
And Paul Cook. One stroppy kid came in the store, desperate to buy a pair of shoes. Mm-hmm. And I just had a sort of hunch. I looked at him and I sort of asked him if he could sing. Looked at me as if I was totally mad, mm-hmm. and said, no. And I thought, well, can you play something, maybe? And he said, I can play the violin, but out of tune. I thought he was a total perfect. So I've got to hire this guy. Uh-huh. So it wasn't long after that we discovered that he had the worst teeth I'd ever seen.
Is that right?
Well, Johnny Lydon's name came about because of his bloody teeth, man. They were so dreadful. Steve Jones looked at him, even though he was an absolute arch thief. Uh-huh. I thought that he's got the worst rotten teeth I've ever seen. And that name just stuck, Johnny Rotten.
Johnny Rotten, yeah.
With the
That'll
green
sell
teeth.
Tickets. Uh-huh. Did these guys at the very least, did they get along well? I mean, were they at least friends?
No, they hated each other. They really did.
Really?
But one brilliant thing, I have to say, the most brilliant thing is they hated everything else. Mm-hmm. And with that, I had a united force. I was together.
And you
agreed with them.
No, I can't be bothered with them either. Don't know what we're going to do. Really, if I've got to talk about the Sex Pistols.
Beethoven, Mozart, Bach and Brahms have all died. Really? What are we saying, sir?
Wonderful people.
Are they?
Oh, yes, they really turn us on.
What do they do?
Well, suppose they turn other people on.
That's just their tough tricks.
It's what?
Nothing, a rude word. Next question.
No. What was the rude word?
Shit.
Go on, you've got another 5 seconds. Say something outrageous.
You dirty bastard.
Go on, again.
You dirty fucker.
What a clever boy.
What a fucking rotter.
You're acting as spokesman for the group today.
Yes, indeed. People are sick and fed up with this country, telling them what to do.
And from this moment forward, the clothing that came out of Sex and later Seditionaries was fueled by the popularity of the music, and the music was fueled by the popularity of their clothing, making everything seem more radical, more anarchic, more punk. They had just the right raw potential Malcolm was looking for. Power Malcolm is going to harness into the British punk movement. And I'm quick to say British punk movement because punk's origins are American.
Where did punk start? New York! Punk rock started right fucking here.
Do you think the Americans are smart enough to bring up something like punk?
Punk rock is about aggression in New York.
It was definitely London. Punks in England were more outrageous than in America.
London punk was all copied from New York.
It was the British people that took punk and used it to give the youth a voice.
It was about taking your stand and just having the music, live through the music, man. Just having a good time. You know, I think it got more violent on the political tip though in London.
There are actually two widely held beliefs about punk. One is that it started with garage bands at CBGB's in New York with Richard Hell, Tom Verlaine, and Iggy Pop, the grandfather of punk.
Damn gay, the Stooges. And they had a lot of sex together. The New York Dolls were born.
I started in 71 with the first Salts album.
The music is rough, not polished. The lyrics are shouted, not sung. The Dolls are a social phenomenon. In the city, they sell out wherever they play. This is a new generation and a new music.
People like the Dolls and Lou Reed, people like Iggy Pop, they were the ones that, like, people were in this country anyway, that's where they got their ideas from.
The boy grips Johnny, he pressed him against the locker, he drove it in and tried to...
Patti Smith, she wasn't just some bimbo go-go girl or someone's girlfriend. She was this wonderful poet and a wonderful singer.
I always hope that people will have some kind of orgasm through my work.
And the other belief is that punk was started by three high school friends who started a magazine called Punk in the early 70s that reflected their interest in TV reruns, beer, sex, burgers, comics, B-grade movies, and the rock and roll that nobody but them seemed to like, that included the Velvets, the Stooges, and the New York Dolls. Regardless of which you choose to believe, punk is remembered as a British hardcore movement centered primarily in London that lasted around 30 months from August 1975 to January 1978. It was a group of around 200 teenagers led by a handful of agent provocateurs in their 20s whose headquarters were at 430 Kings Road at Sex.
Fashion and music come together, then a scene happens, a look happens, and something more important happens in the culture, and that's usually from a very young perspective.
Malcolm wanted to take everything to the most irresponsible extreme, and the state of Britain in the mid-70s made it the ideal time and place to lead a group of disengaged youth to anarchy. Punk's vitriol was born from the damage inflicted during Malcolm's childhood and the couple's pure hatred for the establishment, with Malcolm saying, "She never really got it. I was so urban." Punk was a product of a much darker childhood than hers, rooted so much in the politics of the 60s, which Vivienne had absolutely no association with. She didn't understand how to be dangerous with style, who could not create poetry out of potent symbols. She had a romanticized notion of historicism and tradition, but her sincerity was heavy-handed. And as much as I hate to admit it, maybe Malcolm was a little right. Vivienne didn't grow up in London during the 60s. She didn't understand the anger most teens felt. She was angered by the establishment, yes, but these teens were angry. They were fueled with rage at the generations before them who let them down, who didn't know how they were going to survive. And yes, Vivienne has been known to romanticize history. We'll get to that. But Malcolm needed Vivienne's practicality and application to kick off the movement. Without her, punk would have went nowhere. And without Malcolm, punk would have went nowhere. Punk was a state of mind, but it was rooted in fashion and chaos. No other generational movement has had the greatest impact on Western pop culture, from music to fashion and graphic design to politics, than punk. Maybe the hippie movement, but I don't necessarily care for spoiled rich kids wanting to do drugs and pretend their lives were hard. But the major difference between American punks and British punks was that American punks were typically middle class and educated, while British punks were primitive, instinctive, self-destructive, and way more aggressive. The British punk movement attracted people from all social classes who were suffering through Britain's biggest economic recession since the 30s. Unemployment had risen, and in contrast to the hippies who enjoyed economic prosperity, punks grew up in despair and were often casted off as figures of real-world urban decay. They didn't seek escapism in drugs, utopian politics, communes, or dreams of liberalism. They were depressed, poorly educated, and angry, wondering how they could possibly find peace and happiness in an impossible future. They appropriated the economic crisis with apocalyptic anarchy. What held the social classes together was the frustration they felt, with one teen saying you could be from a tower block or be a middle-class student who went to Cambridge. The whole point of punk is that it was a group of outcasts from whatever background, and that was the common bond. Some were middle class like Malcolm, but they lacked the raw talent and anger of the working class punks like Johnny Rotten, Sid Vicious, Jordan, and Steve Jones, who were so vital to punk. Because while Malcolm lit the black flame candle, he wasn't some punk mastermind. He didn't involve himself much in the movement nor propel it forward. He was mostly swept up in the storm, and while he got off on chaos, he didn't incite chaos. He got others to do that for him. He merely became the face of the movement, while Vivienne was one of his instigators who would often start fights at his events. One time she even got punched in the face by Johnny Rotten and loved it. The social and political conditions made it an ideal time for Malcolm to engage the misunderstood youth with anarchy. Punk was what it was because of the music and the fashion and the music. Punk saw the birth of a marketing partnership between music and fashion, and the Sex Pistols were tied to the success of Malcolm and Vivienne, just as Malcolm and Vivienne were tied to the success of the Sex Pistols. Malcolm created the band and used them as giant advertisements. Yes, the Sex Pistols were the perfect product placement because everything they wore was from Sex and later Seditionaries. As the band's popularity grew throughout London, punks ran to the shop to get their hands on pieces that made them feel like an authentic part of the movement. And it truly can't be understated that the clothes made the music more radical, but the music also made the clothes more radical. Very soon after, the Pistols had a following from the Bromley contingent, a group of Sex Pistol fans who mostly came from the town of Bromley and consisted of Simon Barker, Debbie Juvenile, Lindy Ashby, Susie Sue, Stephen Servine, and Billy Idol. A group of suburban teens who were the first hardcore punk fans, liberated by the movement's DIY ethos, and who helped to popularize the fashion of early UK punks. The Bromley contingent was spreading the message that the rock stars like David Bowie were no longer being admired as they had become richer and less accessible, while the plight of British teenagers had become poorer and hopeless. Fans couldn't relate to the rock stars' lifestyles and expensive dandyism. Confrontation and defiance was the way of the youth, a badge to identify their common bomb. Don't dream it, be it, a line from the Rocky Horror Show, became the rallying cry for the punks. It was a reaction to how rock and roll had been washed of its hardcore appeal, and they were urging the youth to rise up.
Well, people are sick everywhere. People are sick and fed up of this country, telling them what to do.
But not getting paid for it.
Pardon?
But not getting paid for putting on that sort of public show.
Well, nor are we. We ain't even being allowed to play.
What sort of future do you see that a band like the Sex Pistols having? A long future?
I do indeed. I think at least they're standing up and not tolerating any form of censorship in their act. And in that sense, it's exhilarating a lot of young kids around the country and giving them confidence to stand up and say what they want. Look, our group is creating a generation gap for the first time in 5 years in this country, and a lot of people are feeling genuinely threatened by it.
Because while the punk movement helped the couple's business grow financially, it did strain Vivienne and Malcolm's relationship. Steve Jones, who lived with them at the time, recalled how Vivienne could get quite violent with Malcolm and would boast to him about how she'd hit Malcolm the night before or that she'd lock him in a cupboard. And Vivienne refuted this by saying, "That's a lie. We didn't have a cupboard. I'd lock him in rooms or slam a door at him. He goaded me. He drove me into a fury." Jordan remembers that Malcolm was often left embarrassed by Vivienne's inhibited outbursts and felt belittled by her constantly calling him names, because although he liked to present himself as a rebel, he was quite conservatively conventional. But while Malcolm was embarrassed, he still reveled in the reputation and got a kick out of it as much as Vivienne did. But he did get tired and would often leave Vivienne to go spend time with other women. One ex-girlfriend remembers a time when Malcolm tried to leave Vivienne and was so afraid that he couldn't even walk down the street of their Nightingale apartment, so in retaliation, Vivienne withheld all shop earnings from him until he moved back. And to get back at her, Malcolm began devoting more and more time to the Sex Pistols, leaving most of the store runnings to Vivienne, and would only get involved when it came to the messaging and the t-shirts. For the most part, Vivienne was left to create, and in a few short months, she evolved from a seamstress who interpreted Malcolm's instructions into a designer in her own right. She still acted in his directions, but her beliefs in her own creative abilities took root and she flourished. She was more determined than ever to leave her mark on the establishment, saying, "Up until the Sex Pistols and punk rock, I'd never thought of myself as a designer. I just thought of myself as helping out Malcolm on his projects, doing research, and things like that." For Vivienne and Malcolm, punk was a continuation of their commercial exploitation of youth culture and the fusion of previous post-war punk cults like rocker, teddy boy, mod, and more. So punk was derived from previous cults and took symbols and styles from these groups to remake in their own image and to provoke rage. Vivienne said that their motives for being anti-establishment were already in their culture. When she and Malcolm first started making clothes, they were looking at their own lives and trying to express rebelliousness while throwing out all motives. So the principal designs and signifiers of punk never originated with them. They originated with the people out there, the youth. The couple really took from everywhere. Vivienne's bricolage included cultural, subcultural, historical, and contemporary symbols and styles. From David Bowie and glam rock, she borrowed narcissism, gender ambiguity, and nihilism. From the Berlin period, Sid Vicious and Jordan, she drew imagery from the German Third Reich. From contemporary New York, they borrowed details from Richard Hell and the New York Dolls. She even explored Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades, in which he took everyday mass-produced objects out of their context. Sexual bondage gear fused with Dadaism and Surrealism. From the punks, she took black bin liners, Hoover rings, badges, metal fastenings, and bike and lavatory chains. She took drain pipes from the Teddy Boy movement, safety pins from Johnny Rotten via Richard Hell, who pioneered the shredded and ripped clothing, and from Jordan, she took military dress, Nazism, and artificial makeup. Punks celebrated the sordid, the cruel, the inappropriate, and poor taste, and Vivienne seized upon everything, even those of political bad taste, like the swastika, sexual bad taste, like a used tampon, the macabre, like bruised eye makeup inspired by Stanley Kubrick's 1971 film A Clockwork Orange, and the morbid, like a skinny black tie worn like a noose. The most articulate exponents of punk achieved a look that communicated and recognized all the pain and anguish of their lost adolescence and drew attention to the purposelessness that the youth felt. Their sartorial obscenities celebrated their self-imposed exile from society. Vivienne synthesized everything into her work, and everyone was amazed by her original creativity, with Jordan saying she looks, really looks. She doesn't take things for granted. In studying and feeling the cloth, she really wants something from it when it's made. She doesn't like and doesn't have this fashion banter the way fashion designers rave about something. She really means it. She loved learning different techniques, but her real gift was that she never lost that childlike fresh view of her surroundings, like everything was happening for the first time. And Vivienne was excited by the political exhortation, hoping to start a social revolution, while Malcolm was more adept at selecting slogans and graphics, plundering through a variety of resources. He was a cultural magpie. He took an inverted image of the crucifixion of Christ, put Mickey Mouse on the cross, and in big, bold, block letters wrote "Destroy." And they emphasized other t-shirts with quotes and excerpts from the anarchist cookbook, which included instructions on how to make a Molotov cocktail. And like I've probably said 11 times, Vivienne and Malcolm were trying to incite chaos and disrupt the status quo. They even had begun encouraging violent uproars in various settings, and Vivienne even began fights at Sex Pistol gigs to draw attention to punk violence, which had a very theatrical feel to them. Malcolm liked to watch as Vivienne, who believed these violent acts would bring about change, participated. She really thought that everything they did, from inciting violence to creating and selling t-shirts, was going to enact the change she wanted to see in the world, and she held on to that belief strongly. So much so that when customers came into the shop, Vivienne would interrogate them. One former employee said Vivienne used to harass people. She wanted to find out the reason why they wanted to buy it. She thought that all the people had the same emotional or political reason for buying it. It was almost as if those people had to prove they were worthy to buy it. And many customers would end up leaving because they were fed up with the questioning by Vivienne, and it was constant. She questioned strangers about what they were wearing, interrogated them, wanting to know their true motives, because if you wore her clothes, you had to be committed to the cause. Carolyn Baker of ID Magazine and the Sunday Times said Vivienne had one vision and one idea, and if you were even a little bit shy, she would never soften up or come down on you. She was very aggressive and daunting. A former employee said that both Malcolm and Vivienne were incredibly immoral, but between the pair, Vivienne was the cruelest, more fanatical, that even Malcolm was taken aback by her obsessive commitment to the cause. Fashion editors who visited Sex and later Seditionaries actually preferred talking to Jordan because they found Vivienne frightening. With Vivienne even saying herself, "Andy Warhol always confused me with Jordan. When he went to meet me, he was expecting Jordan, and he was terribly disappointed." but I was very aggressive about punk in those days. It was like a you're with me or against me kind of thing. It was like, the world's so dreadful, and anybody who isn't fighting this must be, I don't know, sour? But Vivienne was just so loyal to the cause. She truly believed punk was the start of a revolution, the answer this generation was looking for, and she wanted to make sure the people who wore their clothes were just as loyal to the cause as she was. With her saying, my attitude was, how can I make this represent boredom to the kids? You have to put it in context, a Saturday night context, maybe a little quotation at the bottom. It was me that did the anarchy things. I'm a great believer in people's commitment to ideas, and if they wear my clothes, they have to be committed, because they would go unnoticed, and they'll arouse comment and horror. To keep up with the Sex Pistols' message of sedition and anarchy, Vivienne and Malcolm decided that the shop needed a change. They wanted to seduce people into revolt, and to keep up with their image of the Sex Pistols and their call for sedition and anarchy, they closed Sex down in December '76 and reopened it under the name Seditionaries, in hope of seducing people into revolt, with Vivienne saying, the word seditionaries, which I use to rename the shop, has always meant to me the necessity to seduce people into revolt. It grew from Situationist International with a desire to make change through shock, to seduce people into revolt. And on every piece of Seditionaries clothing was an anarchist symbol along with a tag that read, for soldiers, prostitutes, dykes, and punks. The punk movement was now getting an official uniform. Vivienne and Malcolm had redesigned the shop to feature high-tech industrial materials like heavy-duty rubber flooring and galvanized plate glass windows. The overall theme was the bombed-out city of Dresden, which was a truly provocative choice, since the bombing of Dresden was regarded by many in Britain as the worst crime of World War II. Vivienne's idea of using Dresden was that you had to be brave to walk through the fire, or well, the doors, because you don't know what's behind them or what lies ahead, so only the brave who entered were allowed to wear the clothes. Upon entering, on the walls were images of Dresden in ruins. The back wall was decorated in full-color photos hung upside down a Piccadilly circle, and 3/4 of the way into the store was a kidney-shaped counter with a high-tech TV suspended above, and to one side stood a table in which a live rat paced up and down inside. That's disgusting. The stark interior was lit by spotlights placed in jagged holes in the ceiling tiles, an imitation of bomb damage. They had this odd idea to hide their merchandise in boarded-up facades and tucked into boxes, but many customers had a difficult time finding anything. Besides that, many couldn't even afford their pieces, so they just stole from them. And it was easier to do that when everything was hidden away or stuffed into boxes. Vivienne's work was getting quite expensive for the time period. At the time, around £35 a week was a good weekly wage for a young person, and Vivienne's popular bondage pants were about £50. Special shirts were around £30, and shirts were around £7 to £8. Vivienne argued that the high cost of her work was part of the commitment punks made to fight the establishment, and if people couldn't afford her clothes, they could make them on their own, which is what they were doing in the first place, as a lot of the inspiration for her work came from those who couldn't afford her work and made their own instead. So really, her work was for the middle and upper class punks who could actually afford her pieces, while those who really exuded punk's anarchic spirit simply became the guiding post for her work at Seditionaries.
Hello, Mr. Nemo. What do you actually
Clothes.
Cardigans you can see throughout, it's all wool is.
These restrict your arm movements somewhat.
So you're really caught right down there in bondage.
Yes, but to move in that has a lot of style and flair, because as you move, you can sort of see through some of the when you wear this,
yes,
you can see sort of a body here with bits of lacy stuff in between. It really does.
Should never suit me. Well, what's actually wrong with what I'm wearing?
Mate, you look so bloody boring. I cannot believe it.
I agree with you. Yes.
It's a question of how you feel.
Punks were free to wear whatever they wanted, but Vivienne and Malcolm tried to create a cohesive uniform for the movement. However, Seditionaries' clothing unleashed violent reactions. Punks' clothing became armor. People slept in the clothes, fought in them, and got beat up in them. These were dangerous and powerful pieces of fashion that you had to have the balls to wear, because oftentimes you'd get confronted on the street and have to stand up for yourself or get beat to near death. Vivienne and Malcolm had even created bondage trousers that had straps connected to the back of both legs that restricted one's walk. Everyone wore these. Punk wouldn't be what it was without those pants.
I made the bondage trousers, and then he, absolutely brilliantly, put the strap round the leg
I came up with the idea, well, you know, you've got to tie the legs together, so we've got to form a strap around the kneecaps. We should have a zip that wouldn't ordinarily end at your balls, but would go right up your bum. So you could immediately undo the zip and the whole goddamn lot would just fall out.
And he just said that we should attach this little flap thing on the back, and he was right. I remember asking him what the toweling flap was supposed to be, and he didn't know. He just thought that it was right that we should put a flap on the back. I said it should be out of toweling for some reason. He wanted to give a suggestion of something tribal, something looking like a loincloth.
So all those things were obviously anti the High Street, anti even the King's Road. Never been seen before.
This is the kind of thing that I'm wearing, but in black and in a tartan.
Tartan's nice. Is that any particular tartan?
Yes, it's ancient MacDonald.
Gosh, I bet those McDonald's of years back didn't think you're going to end up like this.
Vivienne's bondage clothing at sex and seditionaries was widely restricting, but when you put them on, it is said that they made you feel free, and they made you feel stronger. Customers said the bondage clothing made you want to move a certain way and arouse the wearer's sense of sexuality and theatricality. Then Vivienne began incorporating Third Reich symbols into her work. She knew Jordan and Sid Vicious were intrigued by Nazi symbols and had been painting swastikas and emblems onto themselves and their clothing. For them, they had stripped the symbol of its association, as they didn't have any sympathy for the extreme right. They dressed to shock. They liked causing a stir and being hated. They wanted to use taboo imagery without endorsing the ideology behind them. 15 years later, Vivienne said, I am with these people, and I actually started to put swastikas on armbands, and I'm not going to apologize for myself because, to be honest, it was exactly what I was after when I started it. But the way I rationalize it is that we have every right to do it, because what they are saying to the older generation is, you've mismanaged this world, and we don't accept any of your advice, and what's more, we don't accept any of your taboos, and you know we are just going to confront you with this. In later years, she said, when I was with Malcolm, he wanted to shop. I was worried about the swastika, for instance, but Malcolm, being Jewish, had his reasons for wanting to do that kind of thing. Just like Malcolm, Vivienne has a lot of contradictions running throughout her story, so take from it what you will. But like I was saying, punks believed they stripped the swastika of its fascist and genocidal association, using it not in sympathy with the extreme right, but to shock, with one punk saying, punks just like to be hated. They wanted to use the imagery without endorsing it, and while this is confrontational enough, let's talk about their three most controversial pieces of fashion that shook the English and some of which are pretty disgusting. We have the Cambridge Rapist t-shirt, an odd Marilyn Monroe shirt, and the Naked Cowboys. Now let's get into it. Around this time, 1974 to 1975, London women had been terrorized and raped by a disgusting excuse for a man who wore a black leather face mask with the word rapist written in bold white letters across the forehead. It was absolutely horrifying. And then rumors went around that the Cambridge Rapist must have bought the mask at Sex because they sold that exact same mask in the shop. So police went to interview Michael Collins, the manager of Sex, to see what he knew. Now, I don't think the Cambridge dude bought the mask at the shop, so it was a totally baseless rumor, but Malcolm decided to exploit the rumor, saying, I was sure it was one of our customers, so I phoned Scotland Yard and they came to interview me, and I wound up in all the newspapers holding the mask and smiling, and it caused so much publicity that we were inundated with people coming in to buy more of them. Days later, Vivienne and Malcolm had the Cambridge Rapist t-shirt made that had a picture of his face and the words, "It's been a hard day's night." The words were taken from a previous scandal, the death of the Beatles manager Brian Epstein, who died of a suspected drug overdose and sadomasochism. Vivienne justified the sale of this shirt by telling people the Cambridge Rapist was a customer and we thought he should be protected. So we did the t-shirt because ultimately no one is innocent. I'm trying to contain my rage. And if that wasn't sick, the shop was flooded with people coming to buy it. And Vivienne only thought to pull the shirts when they started receiving backlash and bad publicity. That was when she removed the shirts and masks from the shop, only for Malcolm to bring them back out, because for him, no publicity was bad publicity. And that's the thing about Malcolm. He didn't get his kicks from sex or drugs. He found it in voyeurism and the outrage of mainstream opinion. He literally got off on chaos. And I, for one, cannot reconcile with how disgusting this is. I don't care about punk. I don't care that most of them didn't put power into these symbols and words and pictures. I think it's disgusting no matter how you look at it, no matter how you try to argue it. Wearing a t-shirt with a rapist face on it and putting the quote, "It's a hard day's night," I can't handle it. I literally can't. Because when you put it into perspective, wearing the face of a rapist who terrorized women is gross. The next controversial shirts included Marilyn Monroe. Vivienne actually made 2 shirt designs featuring Monroe. The first was actually a prototype that never went public and featured a photo of Marilyn Monroe. And on the left sleeve was an erect phallus being jerked off and discharging on her face. And on the right sleeve was the phallus laid flaccid and spent. The other shirt Vivienne made featured Marilyn Monroe on a piss shirt that depicted pretty much the same thing, but with pee. Vivienne created these to shock and provoke, but it really just leaves a bad taste in my mouth, no pun intended, because Marilyn Monroe was literally sexualized her entire life by men. There's literally a dead man buried face down over her grave. The last thing she ever needed in life was for another woman to sexualize and brutalize her image that way. The last controversial, well, not controversial in my opinion, is 2 naked cowboys, which displayed 2 cowboys face to face in Stettons and boots, naked from the waist down, with their penises drawn, dangling so close they almost touched. One man, Alan Jones, wore that shirt August 1975 and actually got arrested in Piccadilly Circus for wearing it. Soon after, the police raided the shop and arrested Malcolm and Vivienne, who actually had to go to court over this. The police wanted to charge them, and it's actually wild. Prosecutors argued the shirts were against the law because the penises were touching, so someone actually had to get out a ruler and measure the distance between them.
What has happened that we got arrested for selling this t-shirt, and myself and Malcolm defended it in court that it wasn't indecent. So the judge convicted us, but it was that the penises were almost touching, therefore it was indecent. And the third reason was that one man was tying the other's necktie.
They were eventually let off, but for Alan Jones, they never showed up to support him or help him with his fine, even though his arrest got the shop its publicity. They left him behind, and that's how they were. That was punk. Vivienne and Malcolm got so much press from this arrest, people were showing up daily looking to buy it. And the police began conducting surprise raids on the shop, but never could find where they hid them. Vivienne was really blooming. She played on the theme of sex, coming up with surreal designs like a pair of naked breasts printed on a t-shirt. The sexual imagery and shocking displacement caused a fury when seen on a man. Nothing could stop them. They were getting publicity for everything, and the kids were buying up their clothes, eager to anger their parents, t-shirts, and the public. They lit a fire in them because of how shocking the pieces were. That's all that mattered, the shock value, to be shocking, to annoy people, because they were misunderstood youths, just like all of us were at some point. I mean, I was never misunderstood enough to wear a t-shirt based on an actual rapist, but who am I? I did wear knee-high lace-up Converse. Vivienne was exploring her creativity. She began burning cigarette holes into the clothing. Sid Vicious even came up with the idea of wearing a used tampon as a brooch. Really, he just took a felt tip marker and colored the end of a tampon bright red and hung it from his jacket. He also began wearing garters over his jeans and a padlock on his crotch. Vivienne loved it. And to keep up with the demand, Vivienne even reached out to Jordan for help. Jordan mentioned that she knew how to sew, so Vivienne put her to work and had her working in a tiny cubicle with a bare light bulb, a sewing machine, and a pile of things she needed to work on. Vivienne had her working for hours without the money to support the time involved and would feed her things like sunflowers and potatoes. But every time Jordan brought up her issues, Vivienne would remind her that it was an honor to be working for the church of Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, telling her, when I took you on to do anything I asked. Don't forget you're on my bandwagon. I'd fight her. Vivienne was growing a bit of an ego, as you can see, and during this time, the Sex Pistols were also riding an ego boost. In February 1977, the Sex Pistols had kicked Glenn Matlock out of the band and replaced him with Sid Vicious, Johnny Rotten's best friend and lead singer of the Sex Pistols. For a while, Malcolm had been wanting Sid to join the Sex Pistols, saying, if Johnny Rotten is the voice of punk, then Vicious is the attitude. While he always was meant to be a member of the band instead of Johnny Rotten, Sid Vicious wasn't angry. He was a Sex Pistols uber fan. He never missed a show. He got drunk and caused chaos at every single show, with many even saying that Sid Vicious was offered up as this sacrificial lamb to the audience, as no one would have been willing to go over the top if not for Sid starting fights. And I feel so bad for how everyone treated this boy who obviously needed help. But that's not for this video. Everyone from Vivienne to the fans thought Sid was a better fit for the band because of his raw and primal allure. And he is without a doubt the most notable member of the band for many reasons. But he wasn't even in the band, I think, for like a year before they broke up. And yet his impact on punk and the Sex Pistols is profound. So let's get into it. Sid Vicious joined the Sex Pistols in February 1977, and everyone was excited. The band was really trying to do something. They were really trying to make music that spoke to a discontented youth. So by bringing in Sid, they thought he was going to drive and push the band further. But from the moment he joined the band, everything got fucked up. Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten fell out almost immediately, and these two were best buds forever. Sid Vicious was named after Johnny Rotten's hamster. So, like, these dudes grew up together. They were best buds, and now they weren't. Vivienne said, I was instrumental in Sid being in the Sex Pistols. It was me. It was very naive of me. Sid, he was a very bad person. He simply didn't know the difference between right and wrong, so you couldn't really be that much of a friend to Sid. But Sid was devoted to the Sex Pistols. He loved them. But everything did fall apart by his inclusion in the band. His focus was on being as outrageous as possible. All he wanted to do was invoke chaos, which, to be fair, was his job before he was in the band. He was creating chaos at the shows and on the street, and I'm sure Malcolm told him that that was his sole purpose in the band, to incite chaos. But the rest of the band hated it. They wanted to play and get their message across, but they couldn't really do that when Sid was thrashing around on stage. He wasn't taking the band seriously. He wasn't interested in learning the bass. He was missing rehearsals and recording sessions because he was in the hospital from his drug use, and he made no contributions to their album Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. His drug use got so out of control, and it only got worse when Sid met Nancy Spungen, who he fell in love with almost immediately. Nancy Spungen was an emotionally disturbed wild child who had violent outbursts throughout her life, and at 17 years old, she moved to New York and became a groupie for Aerosmith, the New York Dolls, and the Ramones. In 1976, she moved to London, where she set her sights on Johnny Rotten. But once she met Sid Vicious, the pair became inseparable.
Should we kiss for you? I've been with Sid ever since the first day I ever got to England, and we're partners in crime.
Their relationship was volatile, violent, abusive, and toxic. She got him hooked on heroin, and that truly ruined everything. Sid began to aggressively play up the public perception of punk being equated to violence, and the drugs enabled him to endure some serious beatings, knifings, and more. And then the heroin started to travel throughout the London punk scene, and the violence proved to be too much for many. Soon the Sex Pistols were getting banned from almost every venue throughout London. The entire band, Vivienne and Malcolm, all hated Nancy, dubbing her Nauseating Nancy. I'm sorry. That's not me.
Well, Sid would have died 15 deaths if I hadn't been around. That's just, the way he is. And when he's not, this is what he does when he's not with me.
Malcolm even admitted a plan to have her abducted and forced onto a plane back to the US. They really hated this chick. They really hated this chick. But Malcolm was pushing the band to stay focused as he was determined to release their anti-royalist single, God Save the Queen, which would coincide with the celebration of the Queen's Silver Jubilee in June '77. The song, dubbed The Queen a figurehead of a fascist regime.
You thought you'd gotten rid of us, didn't you? But you were wrong, old bean, because we're back with a vengeance.
God save the Queen, my son.
And the single was so popular it reached #1 on the charts, despite every record store refusing to sell the album, and the #1 slot was left blank on the charts as no one wanted to publicize the song. British society was polarized between the monarchist majority, who stood by the gates and waved in honor of the Queen's Jubilee, and the minority who gravitated towards the anarchist message of "fuck the monarchy, they've done nothing for us." To coincide with the release of the song, Vivienne put out the God Save the Queen t-shirt that used the postage image of Queen Elizabeth II's face, which was impaled by a giant safety pin. Jamie Reed, a British artist, is the creator of this shirt. Originally, the shirt read "Destroy" in big block letters, but Malcolm replaced them with hand-drawn letters to match the anarchic theme and communicate a sense of fallout. These little details is what pushed the work further and what makes Malcolm an absolute true genius. Jamie Reed is also an incredible genius who is responsible for the creation of the Anarchy in the UK shirts, made with stripes of black, red, and brown, and stenciled with the words "Only anarchists are pretty," while others were hand-painted on silk or muslin with references to anarchist heroes or events like the Paris uprisings of May 1968, while the muslins were inspired by Grindelwald's paintings of the crucifixion of Christ in the 16th century and Dickinson rags. The shirts were meant to be shocking because they were telling the bourgeois and uppity English society that they were tired of the Queen, everyone was corrupt, and everyone was responsible, and everybody wanted to get their hands on these shirts.
As long as fucking kids know that shit's fucked up and that fucking things need to change, fucking stay alive.
Anarchy is a very personal thing. That's what punk is. Punk is your own personal anarchy.
Yeah, man. I am an anarchist. Don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I want to destroy it. Toss it by God. Wanna be fucking anarchist.
Then on June 7th, 1977, to mark the end of the Jubilee, while the Queen was riding past fans, Malcolm held a party for 200 people on the Thames riverboat. It sailed under the banner, "Queen Elizabeth welcomes the Sex Pistols." And while they were playing, a scuffle broke out and the police were called. Alan Jones remembers that as the officers boarded the boat, Vivienne pulled down her pants and peed over the side of the boat in full view of the police, resulting in her arrest. Then they started pulling people down by the hair and arresting them, which included Malcolm. At the time, in their eyes, the event was more successful than they could have imagined. But years later, Vivienne would say this was around the time she was growing tired of the band. She was constantly worried about the designs, what Malcolm would think of them, and if their work was engaging enough. They had a lot going on and the couple were moving in different directions. Malcolm wasn't as hands-on as he should have been. He was more focused on the band, self-promotion, money, and chaos. And over time, Vivienne refused to be involved in his planned publicity stunts, like one where he wanted her to set fire to the Beatles wax figures at Madame Tussauds, and Vivienne refused because she knew the fire could endanger people, and because Malcolm wouldn't be anywhere near the area when it happened, but would still reap the benefits of being the mastermind behind it. And more often than not, she was putting her own life on the line. Like the Sex Pistols' Thames Riverboat disaster, where she was thrown to the ground, kicked repeatedly by the police, and arrested. She was getting tired, she was getting older, and they were growing apart. She began focusing her time on the political impact of fashion and experimenting with her sexuality. Malcolm even recalled finding her in bed with other women multiple times. Their relationship weighed on her just as much as the punk movement. She was getting older and tired. She had neglected her children for punk because of fashion, which she saw as her crusade, once saying, "I was messianic about punk, seeing if one could put a spoke in the system." And in the end, punk really didn't become the revolution she thought it would be. She called it a marketing opportunity, and she yearned for more. She needed the movement to go faster, and it wasn't. And she realized that the youth weren't attacking the system or establishment, but were actually part of the distraction. And that changed everything for her. By spring '77, it was clear that the Sex Pistols were heading for a fallout. And if you believe what Vivienne claims, this was her and Malcolm's plan all along. They wanted to split the band up, starting with little things like replacing Glenn Matlock with Sid, who they thought would be enough to destroy the band. And he really did become their fabulous disaster. With Vivienne saying, "We had to destroy the band. That was the only way to snatch the initiative back from the record industry. We had to end the whole adventure in the spirit it began. Unfortunately, in the end, we couldn't trust the band to be radical. In the end, all of them just wanted to be rock and roll stars, even Sid. Even though they created them, they now wanted to destroy them." These poor kids. In December '77, Malcolm had the band perform for the children of firefighters who were on strike. In videos, Rotten claims that they had to warn Sid not to be the hardcore tough rocker bloke in front of the children, which proves the band wasn't entirely stupid and crazy. They weren't going to scare these children. They cared about keeping the band alive, while Malcolm and Vivienne did everything they could to destroy them. And Malcolm even took it a step further in January '78 when he had the genius idea to have the band go on a 2-week US tour. And this is where everything fell apart, for 2 reasons. One reason was that the band tried to keep Sid clean throughout the tour, so they banned Nancy from coming on tour with them, which caused Sid to act out violently. And the other reason was that Malcolm didn't have the band perform at CBGB's or Max's Kansas City in New York, but instead opted for small venues in conservative southern states like Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, and Texas. A controversial tour that Malcolm believed would cause the biggest uproar and receive the greatest headlines, dressed in Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren seditionaries. Their poster for the tour read, "Where the flowers in the dustbin, where the poison in your human machine, we're the future, your future." At one show in San Antonio, Sid struck an audience member with his bass. In Memphis, Sid was arrested for trying to buy heroin and was beaten by their security team. So before the show in Dallas, Sid carved the words "Give me a fix" into his chest with a razor and then joked on stage, "If you try to kill yourself with a razor to the chest, it won't work." Then at the show, he greeted the audience by saying, "Cowboy F slur." In response, one audience member threw a full can of beer at his head, which only riled him up more, so then he spat blood in a woman's face, which caused her to climb on stage and punch him in the face. Sid was acting out and the band was having none of this. By this point, everyone was sick of Sid's antics, and Malcolm had conspired to make Johnny Rotten out to be the problem for Cook and Jones. So no one was really speaking to each other, and at their last show in San Francisco, for the encore, Johnny Rotten said, "You'll get one number and one number only." That song was No Fun by Iggy Pop. Near the end of the song, Rotten fell to his knees and chanted, "This is no fun, no fun, this is no fun at all, no fun." And as the final cymbals fell silent, Rotten addressed the audience saying, "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night." Then he threw his microphone down and walked off stage, marking the end, a 2-week tour that was cut short after 5 shows.
Here's the encore for the Sex Pistols.
You'll get one number and one number only, because I'm a lazy bastard. This is no fun. This is no fun, no fun, it is no fun at all, no fun. Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night.
Johnny Rotten's relationship with the band and Malcolm deteriorated, with him saying, "I felt cheated, and I wasn't going on with it any longer." It was a ridiculous farce. Sid was completely out of his brains, just a waste of space. The whole thing was a joke at that point. Malcolm wouldn't speak to me. He wouldn't discuss anything with me. And then he would turn around and tell Paul and Steve that the tension was all my fault because I wouldn't agree to anything. Malcolm really mentally and psychologically abused these boys for kicks. For a while, the rest of the band tried to stay together. However, they never performed it live again. In 1978, Rotten filed legal proceedings against Malcolm over claims of non-payment of royalties, and it was only after hearing the evidence mounted against Malcolm that Steve Jones and Paul Cook joined Johnny Rotten's side in the proceedings. And they did manage to get what they were owed.
Yeah, well, a lot of the ideas he never told us, you know. He just used to shove us out there, and we just get on and do our thing, play, and he never told us half the things he was scamming, you know what I mean? And that was basically the same with me, Cook, and Matlock. I guess Rotten had a bit more sass than all of us. But, I was a real ding-dong, really. He was using us in the way that, Brian Epstein used the Beatles, you know what I mean? I mean, he didn't look after the band. He didn't look out for its financial idea of it. He just, you know, another scam, what else can we do? What else can we do to get the ball rolling more, you know, more popular? Which was great. I mean, you know, I still think he's a great manager. Well, that was another scam with all the clothes, because, like, we had to buy the clothes from his shop, and we'd be on the stage and all the kids would see it, and they'd buy all the clothes, and so we was buying them as well, where, you know, we should have gone for nothing, you know what I mean?
The greatest technique involved in managing the Sex Pistols was always to create the right explosion and then know that it was going to happen, and as a manager, run into the toilet and come out after the explosion and say, God, what's happened?
So while Rotten, Cook, and Jones were suing Malcolm, Sid was in New York with Nancy Spungen at the Chelsea Hotel, where they sank into a drug-induced stupor, and he made money doing a few shows at Max's Kansas City. But then on October 12th, 1978, Sid woke up after taking a bunch of drugs to find a trail of blood that led to the bathroom, where he found Nancy Spungen lying dead. She was 20 years old and had bled to death from a stab wound to her stomach. The police found Sid wandering the hallways in an agitated state. He was arrested and charged with her murder.
Nancy Laura Spungen had been stabbed to death. Police say a collapsible hunting knife lay nearby. Vicious's real name is John Simon Ritchie, and he's been booked for murder. When they transferred him to a detention center, it took 4 men to hold him. Sid Vicious fought his way through a barricade of cameras.
There are claims that he didn't do it. There are claims that he did it, as he reportedly confessed while on drugs. He did later retract this confession, claiming his innocence. But no one really did an investigation into her death, so it's all unknown. Except Vivienne did say in her autobiography, Sid killed Nancy. He admitted it to Malcolm, who told me. He stabbed her. He was out of it, and when he came round, she was dead. Malcolm used to say that Sid would have gotten off. But of course he was dead before it all came to trial. Because after getting arrested, Sid was released on bail, and in February 1979, he died of a drug overdose from drugs supplied by his mother.
Newspaper here, I mean, it's dated Saturday, February the 3rd. I remember the day I woke up and Malcolm was just coming in through the front door with the paper, and he said, Sid's dead. Sid's fucking dead,
wow.
You know? I told them, if you're going to let him out, tell me first, because I knew that if you didn't tell me first, his mum would get him. What did his mum do? Took him out. He just got off heroin addiction by being put on methadone in prison. She took him out to a bloody party. Apparently she gave him his usual dose of heroin, and it killed him.
You kidding? Oh, I'm not having fun at all.
Where would you like to be?
Under the ground.
Are you serious?
Sid was completely immoral. He did not know the difference between right and wrong.
Right.
He was highly intelligent, fantastic company, sweet and lovely, as well as mad. Poor old Sid, I mean, he was his mother's victim. He was like spoilt when he was young. I mean, he was spoilt, like ruined. You know, he had no chance of somehow making the right choices in this world. He was an affectionate person.
Yeah.
I don't want people to think that we're aggrandising Sid in any way.
Yeah.
I don't think they should.
Yeah.
He's not a role model, honestly. That's the last thing he is.
And the day Sid Vicious died is the day Punk died. When Vivienne first heard the news of Nancy's murder, she produced a t-shirt printed with his image and a quote that read, "She's dead. I'm alive. I'm yours." And when Sid died, she crafted a Sid action man dressed in a swastika vest and black jeans, which she laid into a coffin and displayed in the shop. And while both Vivienne and Malcolm profited off Sid and his downfall, neither ever accepted responsibility. Malcolm fled to Paris, hid away, and scouted around for new projects while Vivienne retreated. At this point, she was determined to get away from punk. Angered by the way punk had been compromised, she didn't want to be associated with its violent demise. In the years after this, Vivienne said, "Punk folded when the Sex Pistols folded and Sid died. I realized that the kids who were interested in it were interested because of the way it looked. They all went on to do other things, and I don't think any of them had any politics. They just liked having a good time. Others went on to make their whole life around it." Further saying, "I never wanted personal glory or attention." Punk was born out of a lot of things. Out of total misery, oppression, and poverty, times were dark politically, and a small group of discontented youths led the way to the future. And it was the work of women like Jordan and Vivienne Westwood who were able to really encapsulate this fleeting moment of history and have allowed it to withstand the test of time. However, despite the success punk would have in its revival and resurgence through generations of misunderstood youths, Vivienne failed to grasp the importance of what she started with Malcolm all those years ago. After Sid died, Malcolm, who had fallen out with the Sex Pistols and lost everything, was angered and embarrassed, so he fled to Paris and stayed with Casa Bajac for a year, while Vivienne did everything she could to distance herself.
Just as we've been disillusioned with Teddy Boys as not being terribly interesting in the end, etc., we became disillusioned with punk. The thing that really did it for me was when I heard the Clash boasting that they'd never lived, any of them, lower down than 5 stories high. And they seemed to think that that was a great badge of working class credibility. And I just didn't want to be in this tunnel with this kind of dull attitude.
The punks are kind of good because they were trying to attack the establishment. And you can't really attack the establishment. You have to have ideas. You can't just say, I don't know. It was a very, very heroic attempt. But in the end, it just became a marketing possibility. It can sell you safety pins. The punk movement, it was just a fashion that became a marketing opportunity for people. And it's great nowadays to see young people dressed as a punk. But, because it's entered into the iconography of I am a rebel, and that's what I look like if I want to be that kind of rebel. But for somebody my age to think that it's got any credibility in any way, no, it hasn't. It was just an excuse for people to run around.
In doing so, she allowed Malcolm to claim credit for things she had done, and ultimately this cost her a lot. For a long time, she was overlooked in the punk world because of this. With her son Joseph saying, "Vivienne was always very nice about Malcolm, especially with me, but I knew that she wasn't saying what she really felt. She was saying what she thought wasn't going to upset me. But that's Vivienne. It was fucking hard on her. But we should say it like it is now." His story became, the only reason Vivienne ever had any success was because of Malcolm McLaren. And he's right, but only in the sense that he was the instigator. I think the thing that people forget is that Vivienne created. She did the designs. All those fucking amazing punk rock t-shirts, I know they are her because I saw it happen right there. When I was a kid, that was Mom. We had silkscreen machines in our flat, and that table, the one she has in her studio now, we ate at it, but it was always covered in stuff she was printing. And Malcolm's contribution? To belittle her. "Oh, doing your potato cutting again, are you?" All those seditionaries and anarchy shirts, she made them all. She made them in our flat, dyed in our bath, printed in our living room. Week in, week out, making stuff to put in the shop. But Vivienne's own denial, like I said, was based on her failure to grasp what punk unleashed. She was upset that it wasn't the revolution Malcolm led her to believe it was. She had devoted years of her life to the cause. She had put her attention into a revolution instead of her children. And it wouldn't be until 1986 that Vivienne spoke up and said, "The thing is, I invented punk with Malcolm. Together we formulated a master plan for the ultimate rebellion. I wanted to promote change in the very fabric of society, so I am still carrying the torch of punk." However, at the time, in 1986, this statement did nothing to help her cause. By this point, no one believed she had had a hand in punk, especially with the work she was putting out and how she was presenting herself. She had defected from Britain, and the Brits were pissed at her. And we will talk about all of this, but she never really stood a chance. She wouldn't get to defend herself until her Harris Tweed collection in 1987. but I'm getting way ahead of myself. Punk's importance 100% increased over time. From its founding in like 1974 to its end in 1979, it only affected a few hundred people, but its legacy is palpable. From the sloganizing of politics to the breaking down of inhibitions that released a wild amount of creativity. By dismissing traditions, the youth were allowed to create what they envisioned for the future. For example, they no longer felt they had to be musically trained to play the guitar or be in a band, or classically literate to write poetry. Vivienne is the perfect example of a woman raised on the DIY ethos who was unburdened by the conventions of traditional dressmaking and couture, who invented her own form of dress and fashion that redefined history. She has allowed women to take control of their sexuality rather than suppressing it or playing a passive role. Post-punk designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier, Ray Kawakoba, and John Galliano showed a clear influence from her work. And if you are interested in learning more about the Sex Pistols, because I didn't talk about them too much here, there are so many videos out there, including a TV show. There's so many videos out there. Most are included in my sources, but there's also a TV show on Hulu, I think, Hulu, that is based on a memoir written by Steve Jones, and it's actually really, really good. I was hooked on it for a minute. It's worth the watch if you're interested in learning more, or just in the mood for something new to watch. Malcolm and Vivienne are depicted in the show as well. A lot of the people I discussed here are also in the show, and you'll like it if you're even semi-interested in punk. Just don't go and watch any of those Sid and Nancy movies. And before I leave you here today, I just want to say that I think it's easy to look back on punk and see it for what it truly is today. But in Joseph Correa's own words, my parents are not iconic. In the 70s, they were called everything from scum and outsiders to geniuses, and now my mother is considered a national treasure. But back in the day, they had cops banging on their door all the time and people threatening them. Nothing about the punk movement was easy for them. They were anarchists. They were rebels. They fought for everyone else to be able to stand by their beliefs, say what they want to say, be who they want to be, and dress how they want to dress. And this is where I'm going to leave off part 2. Because we have covered so much already, and there's still so much left to cover. Vivienne lived a very interesting and complicated life, to say the least, and I couldn't talk about Vivienne Westwood without talking about the Sex Pistols too, because the two are intrinsically linked. But there's still so much left to cover. We have to talk about the fallout between Vivienne and Malcolm. We have to talk about her work in Italy, as well as her return to London, which we will talk about in part 3, I promise. And part 4 hopefully shouldn't be that long, but if it is, I'm apologizing now. And I hope you're not mad at me. Here's to having a great rest of your day or night, and I hope to see you all again soon for part 3 and part 4. Bye!